Dear friends, good evening. I'm really happy to welcome you to our online event tonight. My name is Jussi Palmen and I'm the cultural counselor at the Embassy of Finland in Moscow. Today we're going to discuss the history of Finnish contemporary art with an extremely interesting guest speaker. And this event goes in the framework of an exhibition of Finnish contemporary art that is currently ongoing at the Moscow Museum of Contemporary Art until the end of January at Yermolaivsky Periulok. And the exhibition features 11 Finnish contemporary artists, and I really recommend you to go and see it if you're in Moscow and have time. And just a couple of technical comments. The audience has the possibility to follow this broadcast on YouTube, and there is 2 channels available, either with a Russian translation or the original one with English language. And if you want to watch the original version, you can just find the link to that broadcast on our chat window. And also, if you have any questions, please feel free to share them in chat, and we'll take them after the lecture part. Tonight our guest speaker is Kati Kivinen, the chief curator of the Contemporary Art Museum Kiasma in Helsinki. Kati, warmly welcome, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jussi, for your kind words. I'll try to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it properly. Is it okay? Okay. So good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to join you for this talk on the past 30 or so years of Finnish contemporary art tonight. Firstly, I would like to express my thanks to the Moscow Museum of Modern Art and also to the Finnish Embassy in Moscow for the kind invitation to present the Finnish contemporary art to you this night. I hope that my talk can shed light on the topic, as well as also at the same time it can accompany in a good way the current exhibition Together Noting, curated by Margareta Osepian at the Moscow Museum of Modern Art. Sadly, I haven't seen the show myself, but I know quite many of the artists and also artworks in the exhibition. But let me start with just a few words on myself. If I just manage to get my presentation, go further. So here. So I'm a Helsinki-based curator and art historian, and I have been working with Finnish contemporary art for the past 20 or so years already. I started my career at the Frame, which is the supporting body for Finnish contemporary art when it's shown internationally. And there I was working in the very beginning of the 2000s. And I think it has also somehow formed my career ever since, because I've been working with the internationalization of Finnish contemporary art ever since in different roles. Since 2003, I have been working in my current home institution, so at the Museum of Contemporary Art Kiasma in Helsinki, first as a curator for temporary exhibitions, and then since 2017, I have been in charge of the collections at the museum. And when I was invited to give this talk on Finnish contemporary art, the proposal was given with the 30-year timeline. But in a way, it came at a very perfect time for me, as we have been just working with my team at the museum on the first collection book of Kiasma's collections. And the time frame for our collections actually and our acquisition activities is exactly the same, the 30 years. So we have been acquiring both Finnish and international contemporary art for the past 30 years. And in my presentation, I will tell you about the scene in Finland, the contemporary art scene in Finland, how it has developed during the past 30 years from 1990s onwards. And many of the examples in my presentation come actually directly from the museum's own collections. That's the area that I know the best. But then also I tell you also a bit about the institutions that have emerged into the contemporary art scene in Finland during this 30 years time. So thus noted here also on this slide, like Amos Rex, Emma, HAM and Serlachius Museum. In the end, I try to wrap up a bit kind of like what is in artist mind today. So to try to shed a bit of a look also to the future. Where is the Finnish contemporary art going? And perhaps before I start, I should say also something about the title of my presentation, Leaps of Fate. That is the title I've been using in some presentations. And for me, the leap of fate is very much involved in my work in a museum that is collecting contemporary art. Because contemporary art is constantly evolving, it's changing, both content-wisely, approach-wisely, but also with its materials and the forms that it takes. And I thus think that it is important for a curator of contemporary art to be able to take these leaps of faith, because you never know what you choose in a moment, if it will be of value in 30 years, or if the materials, for example, chosen will tolerate or stand time for that time, and thus the title for the presentation. Oh, what happened? This went to the end. Just a small moment. This is very unfortunate. So sorry. So here we start in 1990s. 90s is quite interesting and actually important decade for Finnish contemporary art, because many institutions started to form during that time, and also somehow contemporary art became more established also in Finnish art context. But also 90s was economically a very challenging time in Finland. In the 1980s, the contemporary art scene in Finland was in a hype. There was a high art market and artists were selling, especially paintings were selling, and that was the moment of postmodern art, as well as also very sort of like new expressionistic painting. But then came the 1990s, and it came with a huge economic depression and crash, which was one of the worst in Finnish economic, one of the first economic crises in Finnish history. And that had a deep effect, not just in the economy, but also in culture. But still now, when I was looking at back the history, I noticed that actually, interestingly, art was able, and contemporary art was able to find ways, even in this bit of a dire, straight time in Finland in the arts during that time. But what was specific for contemporary art in the 90s was that it was not anymore easy or even important to try to frame art in different sort of like isms or movements, and those were not anymore important for artists. Rather, different phenomena were living beside and sort of like almost like on top of each other during the field, and they were also feeding from each other. So you could say that the 90s was a time for conceptual art, media art, performance art, photography, as well as also installations and community art. At your level also environmental art. But the basic point was that important was what artists wanted to say, and that also was the starting point for the what he or she chose as the, for example, the vehicle to how to say it. What was the medium they chose for their artworks? So thus, instead of just focusing on painting or video or whatever, the artists were choosing whatever medium to express their current topic that they wanted to work on. But then also art started to look a lot, not just at itself, but more towards society, thinking about the relationship between art and the world. And thus, you could say that the art started to have also more say on different things in the society. And those things could be, for example, the multicultural society, different questions on identity, as well as also environmental and ecological questions. They started already there, but then I would say that their high point is currently. Also, different kinds of techniques started to come, and a bit unconventional materials started to come alongside the more usual suspects. But the key probably in initiative was that the Museum of Contemporary Art, after decades of wishes, was established in 1990. So it's fairly young institution internationally when thinking of museums of modern and contemporary art. There were wishes already in the early 20th century to have an institution for contemporary art in Finland, but it was only in 1990 when it was established, and it was first operating in the Atheneum Art Museum building. And then why, for example, photography and video art were quite important in the Finnish art in 1990s, and they were starting to sort of like to gain attention more and more, was perhaps that the University of Art and the Arts Academy in Finland, or the University of Arts nowadays, they started a program for time and space, which was for photography, video, as well as for performance and installations. But then also in the mid-90s, the University of Art and Design, today known as Aalto University, started a media lab, which was already taking the first steps in digital arts in Finland already in late 90s, so quite early on, at the same time when internet started to sort of like gain ground also in private use. And then when looking at different moments of Finnish art history, I also present to you the arts exhibitions, which have been the platform for showing the current trends in contemporary art, both internationally as well as in Finland. And these exhibitions have been organized since 1960s, early 1960s, as we didn't have any venue or museum for contemporary art in Finland. And since 95, they have been a bit more regular. It's not a biennale or triennale, but they happen nowadays more or less every 5 years or so. And our institution is nowadays responsible for them since the first edition at the Kiasma building in 2001. But let me start with the 95 arts exhibition, which was called Public Private, and it was posing questions regarding human identity, human body, death, sexuality, and social gender affiliations, and also looking at the world of media and images of virtual reality. The exhibition had several international, very big artistic names, but I'm presenting to you a small selection of the Finnish artists. Actually quite many painters, photographers, and artists like here, Pekka Niskanen, working with conceptual approach related to more societal topics like identity in his case. In this work, I like Him and Her, where he's looking at the public sort of like descriptions of celebrities like Whoopi Goldberg, the American actor, and then Elton John, the British musician. These posters that he created for the exhibition were shown on the walls of the main post office in Helsinki during the Ars 95 exhibition, which was still at the Atheneum building, since the Kiasma building was still a construction site at that time. Niskanen has, throughout the 90s, was carrying out this sort of like a style of conceptual work, which was very much flirting with the graphic design of that time. That was also an area that he was working on. But nowadays, he's more concentrating in his work on moving image installations and sort of like you could say essay kind of documentaries on different topics around the world. But then the painters that came, the new painters in the 90s, most of them fairly young ones, recently graduating at the end of the 80s and then entering actually quite much through this exhibition to the sort of like center of Finnish art world, like Marianna Uutinen, who took the painting off the wall and off the canvas and brought it into the space, like here directly on the floor and on the mannequin structure, and not painting with a brush, but rather just sort of like using the paint material as it is, as a kind of a stripe on a surface. Another painter nowadays, one of our kind of like most celebrated painters, Roos, who engaged herself into these very monochromatic paintings already back then in early 90s and has continued ever since, and kind of like flirting there between the visible and non-visible and the representative and the abstract imageries in her work. Or then Jussi Niva, who also was exploring space early on in his paintings and rather creating almost like painting installations, which were working with architectural features, and like here also combining a photograph of the very same painting, but sort of like mirrored vice versa on the side of the actual painting itself. But all these artists are still very relevant to the Finnish painting scene. In a way, they are still continuing in the same ways. Niva with these kind of like abstract paintings, playing a lot with colors, whereas Marianna is still keeping the line with exploring the materialities of the painting. Then there was also one a bit older Finnish artist, Outi Heiskanen, who started her career already in early 70s and was very key figure back then in both development of performance art in Finland, but also happenings. But she's mostly known in Finland as a graphic artist, quite usually doing mostly non-color, but black and white graphic art, but then also installations. And actually, just right now, the Atheneum Art Museum is showing a major solo exhibition by her. So if anybody is able to travel still to Helsinki before the end of first week in January, I highly recommend, because it's a great look into the very mesmerizing mythical work of Heiskanen, which explores the female condition, but then also through dreams and myths and also different kind of like fables. Then some other examples from 90s, besides that above mentioned Ars exhibition in 95. Kaisu Koivisto is an interesting artist who was also doing a lot of residencies towards the end of 1990s. She was working, for example, in New York, exploring the 18th century and 17th century history of the Manhattan Island in her interesting works. But here, her conceptual sculpture presents her innovative use of materials and kind of like ready-made objects, where she's here attaching or entwining the cow horns with Alvar Aalto designed 69 model chairs in this piece, Personal Space, from 1999. It's quite typical for Koivisto to work like this, to bring nature and also something which is human-made, artificial together, and also combining valuable or seen valuable materials or objects together with non-valuable materials. And Koivisto as well is still very active in her artistic practice. Then an example of participatory art in the 90s. Lea and Pekka Kantonen are of the first generation of Finnish performance and environmental art generation from the 1980s. But their project called The Tent was their project that started in the 1990s, and it was a multi-year project that took them all around the world, meeting young people in workshops where they were discussing about their lives in Mexico, in United States, in Finland. They were doing this with the Sami children in the very north of Finland. They also did workshops in Estonia. So for them, the art has always been a vehicle of discussion, and then also drawing mind maps of people's lives, and sort of like through that gaining knowledge of their relations and of the importance of family history and also identity, because they've been working a lot, for example, with indigenous communities all around the world, especially in Mexico, and as mentioned also in the north of Finland with the Sami people. But their influence in the field of participatory art has been of key importance in Finland, and also Lea Kantonen has made her own artistic dissertation already in early 2000s on this collaborative project that she made with her husband. Then let's look at one of the things that really started in a very kind of like a hasty way in the 1990s was the sort of like entrance of photography to the field of contemporary art, and especially it was one of the areas that gained a lot of international attention. And it was especially the new trends of documentary photography as presented here by Esko Männikkö and his photographs from the north of Finland of those lonely men living alone in their own cottages, and kind of like very specific characters that Esko knew and went and met and photographed during his trips all around the north of Finland. Or then Jouko Lehtola, a young photographer who started actually as a press photographer and was photographing a lot of music acts and concerts in Finland, but then took this interest of his own towards also art photography and did this massive series in mid-90s on young heroes, which was a series of images of teenagers, young Finnish people, in their kind of like what they were doing during the summers, when they were in the festivals or how they were just hanging around and spending time. So Jouko always had a really interesting eye to find interesting people in different groupings, and then made very memorable portraits of these young people. He already unfortunately died almost 10 years ago, so his career was a bit short-lived, unfortunately, but he really left a very strong impression on the Finnish photography scene. In the end of 90s, we also started to have new interesting young female photographers on the field, one of them being Aino Kannisto, who made her sort of like cinematic moments in photography, some kind of stage self-portraits. She was usually always herself performing in the images. And somehow I have a feeling that kind of like they are perhaps referring a bit to the works of like Cindy Sherman in the United States. A bit of a different approach in photography was with Pertti Kekarainen, who was educated as a sculptor, but then took this conceptual photography of his to the next level, though it's totally analogical. It's not done by, especially in this early 90s works, it's not done digitally, but it's all analogical. But he wanted to sort of like create different spaces or spatial changes through using different visual elements on the two-dimensional surface of the photograph, using elements like lines and bars and spheres and fields of color, and somehow kind of like mixing and making it sort of like not exactly to know what to believe and what you say, kind of like a creation of new interpretation of the space that he is photographing. Vertti continued this work with space and spatial changes all the way until this summer, when he unfortunately passed away, but he left a huge legacy in Finnish photography with his conceptual images. Then some examples from the media art side that started to sort of like develop in huge leaps during the 90s, because it was only in 1980s when we had the first video artist in Finland, but then really it started to take off in the 90s. Juha Vaningen is one of these early characters in the media art field in Finland, and he's always been very interested in the histories and technologies of media art. Like in this example shown here, the Disintegrator, which is a video piece which is using a copied VHA copy of Kurt Neumann's film The Fly from 1958. And the idea in the film is that he has copied with a VHS recorder the film again and again and again. And when the copy is copied again and again in the process, the video signal starts to disintegrate, and it comes just noise and sort of like a snowflake image. And finally, the whole image just disappears in the darkness and it doesn't exist anymore because it gets copied so many times. The key figure in the Finnish media art field since the mid-90s has been Eija-Liisa Ahtila. And in her wake, the Finnish media art scene as well as video art scene has really sort of like propelled into international attention. Ahtila was studying in 90s film, actually in United States, and there is where she got this idea to start to work instead of one image on several images presented in the space simultaneously. And this is one of her first multi-screen video installations, If 6 Was 9, which is dealing with the wishes and hopes of teenagers. So she has interviewed for this work 5 girls from Helsinki who are between 13 and 15. So they are the main protagonist in this work, and they share in the videos their life. They play basketball, they hang out with friends, they remind of films and things they like to watch as a child. And they also share their thoughts on sex from a teenager's perspective. So it's a fictional combination of various elements, but as has been from the beginning, baseline for her work is quite often that there is in the behind always research which is based on interviews with people, though they are not necessarily the works exactly presenting those people. But it's very much due to her achievements that from the end of 1990s, the Finnish media art really started to gain international attention as well. And in the wake of Eija-Liisa, there was also Fanni Niemi-Junkola, nowadays a Tampere-based artist who was also exploring both body, but also political and visual elements in her works, like here in Giants, where in a kind of like slow motion, these 2 women are wrestling next to the seashore. And then in the very end of 90s, as I mentioned, the University of Art and Design started a media art lab. And then we started to have the first artworks also proper digital artworks and new media artworks, one might say it. One of them was Tuomo Tammenpää's Need, which is also in our collection. It's a fair-like presentation of in a physical exhibition space, and then it's in the digital or virtual world, it is a website. And what the project presents is an artificial brand that actually doesn't exist, or the brand exists, but there is no product. So it's an irony of branding or different objects and materials that we think we need and we buy in our lives. So it was kind of like a consumer critical work. And then in 1998, we finally got the building for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Finland, and it became Kiasma. And the name comes from the architect Stephen Hall, who designed the building, which is currently under renovation, and we will reopen the very much a refurbished building in April next year. But this was a key point for Finnish contemporary art to have an own space for contemporary art and its collections. But let's haste then towards the 2000s. The 2000s, I was planning to tell you a bit about two those main components that came sort of like to the international focus, and those being photography and video art, and few examples of exhibitions that sort of like rose the attention towards Finnish contemporary art, which was the 2001 Venice Biennale main exhibition, as well as also 2002 Documenta 11 exhibition with Eija-Liisa Ahtila participating there. One of the kind of like interesting phenomena of the 2000s was also the Helsinki School in Photography, which was University of Art and Design school gallery for contemporary Finnish photography, which actually also still in a form exists, is not anymore directly connected to the school, but very much promoting Finnish photography internationally. But here, one of the artists that took part into the Venice Biennale main exhibition in 2001, which presented all together, was it 7 Finnish artists, so it was quite exceptional. I think it was the biggest national representation that year in the exhibition. For some reason, Harald Seeman was fond of with Finnish contemporary art. So one of the artists was Heli Rekula, video artist and photographer who started already in the 1990s. Her works, which often deal with ideals of beauty, but also questions of normative identity construction, here with her altarpiece from the theme Pilgrimage. A young artist directly from the art school who attended also the Venice Biennale main exhibition was Salla Tykkö, who has become very known after that with her video works. But the Lasso was her graduation piece from the art school, and it presents a moment in a young woman's life when she on a runs across or past the house and sees through the window this young man doing a lasso exercises in the living room. And for the music, she was using Ennio Morricone's haunting sounds from films, and this became as a kind of like a very sort of like a successful combination of images and sound. A bit older artist, Veli Grane, was also one of the artists who was invited to that exhibition, and he's been doing these projects on people already from 90s onwards. And this project that he presented in Venice was called Tangible Cosmologies, and it's a presentation of collectors. And he was traveling around Finland, photographing people who collect things, all kinds of things. And then later on, he has continued this collections of collectors, you might say, in a way, in his photographic works, as he's been interested in exploring the themes of alternative realities. And he has done also extensive research and photographic series on outside artists in Finland. And that's quite an important documentation of a kind of like a disappearing art form that doesn't have similar institutions in Finland like contemporary art or the official contemporary art has. A young artist who was for the first time presented in kind of like big international exhibition in Venice was Laura Horelli, nowadays based in Berlin, or has been there almost already, I think, 20 years. Laura had a project that she was presenting at the Academy Art Gallery in Helsinki on female presidents in the Finland in the world in 2001 when the exhibition took place. And for some reason this approach and kind of like a presentation of female leaders of the world was something that the curator found interesting and freshly invited the young artist to the main exhibition of Venice Biennale, which was quite an amazing start for a career. Nowadays, Laura is mostly working with video, a lot of working with both her own, but also others, let's say, historical image material that she then reconstructs images and stories of past people using archive materials, for example, in her works. Then when moving on, just one example, the first art exhibition that took place in the Kiasma building was 2001, called The Third Space. And that actually was very international exhibition and only had very few Finnish artists. But one of them was Elina Proterus, one of our most known female photographers currently. And Elina's project from the day one when she started during her studies to do photography in late 90s was self-portraits in different forms, but mostly in different surroundings. So the idea in her work is always to think about and consider the artist body in relationship with the place, space, and the landscape. And references to art history and classical works in paintings, for example, are usually there, like in this Der Wanderer piece as well. Then in 2002, in the Documenta exhibition, again, it was Eija-Liisa Ahtila who got the kind of like the position to be presenting Finland there. And there she presented the piece called The House, which is a story about a woman on kind of like on the verge of nervous breakdown. It's part of a series of women, fictive stories of women who have overgone psychosis. And in this house piece, the woman left her house, which is in the middle of the forest, and starts to fly on top of the forest. It's a very beautiful film in 3 screens. And again, here starts to present that format that is quite known nowadays in Ahtila's moving image practice, these multi-screen video installations. Then I will haste to 2006. Again, we were housing art exhibition at the Kiasma called The Sense of the Real. And one of the most kind of like fun and participatory works in the exhibition was the Helsinki Complaints Choir by Tellervo Kalleinen and Oliver Kohta-Kalleinen, a couple that have been collaborating since early 2000s. This project, the Complaints Choir, has already been presented in over 40 different versions around the world. And the idea came when Oliver Kohta-Kalleinen stated to his wife that he wanted to do work about complaining, and then they came about the idea of a choir complaining. And the complaints are always selected to the place where the work is presented. And this has been also seen actually in Russia at St. Petersburg, where the people got the chance to do a bit of a complaining. I think I will have to skip a few to get towards also 2010s. I think I had a few slides too more here, but let me take next Hanna Haaslahti. So in early 2000s, also the interactive media art started to be very much present in Finland, and that was because of the University of Art and Design was supporting through media a lot of the development, but also in the beginning it was very much in the exhibition policy of Kiasma and also in acquisition policy to acquire media art. Though it is a bit challenging, but Hanna Haaslahti's interactive works are a good example. So here the people enter into a white square, which then actually starts to react to their standing there and create. It's not your real shadow that is there on the floor, but it is a shadow that the program directing the work creates for you. And then when two people are in the work together, their shadows start to interact with each other. So it's a kind of like a very nice way of bringing the interactive work towards the audience, and it's a very easy way to participate with the work. So people start to play around with their shadows and how they interact with each other in this one. Another very kind of like a key work in our collection is Terike Haapoja's Community from 2007. Terike has been from early on one of those artists very strongly talking about both the human and non-human condition, and also about the condition of the nature. And Community is exactly about that. It is about animals that have been raised to be mostly production animals, but these animals in this work have died for some natural cause. And what she has filmed when the body of the animal starts to lose the warmth after death. And this is what we see in these round places in the space or the protections. And the duration of the videos vary from 2 hours to 5 hours, depending on how long it takes for the image, when thermal image is taken of the cooling body, how long it takes to present that. This work was also presented in the Venice Biennale when Terike was presenting Finland in the Nordic Pavilion in 2013. Then an example of, again, media art. Mika Taanila is one of the most known explorers of, for example, found footage materials and films in Finland. Like here in Physical Ring, he has brought about a film which was a scientific test film, no knowledge what it was about, but he has used it together with a soundtrack from Mika Vainio, a Finnish electronic musician and sound artist, to accompany and create an interesting dialogue with the music, as well as with the experiment happening in front of us in the film that we don't know what it is about, but he had just got a video or film reel with the text Physical Ring on top of it, and then created his own version, a video installation out of that material. And then I will do a bit of a skipping, sorry, again, just to mention that in end of 2000 and the first decade of 2000s, we gained also another venue for modern and contemporary art in MMOMA, which is in Espoo, next to Helsinki. The museum is not a new building, it is an old print house, which was designed in mid-60s by Arno Ruusuvuori, but it's one of the largest exhibition spaces today for contemporary art in Finland. And alongside the Espoo City collection, it also houses today the Saastamoinen art collection, which is one of the biggest private foundation-based collections in Finland, both for Finnish and international contemporary art. But let's go to more closer dates. So 2010s in Finnish contemporary art. again, here 2 arts exhibitions. I think I will skip the first one and go directly to the 2017, which was in a way quite forming, and then show you some examples of the new spaces that we have got during the 2010s to the Finnish art scene. But 2017, we were housing the previous arts exhibition in Kiasma. And this time it was concentrating on quite young artists. So it was mostly artists born in 60s, 70s and 80s. But that was probably because we were focusing on the global digital revolution and on its impact on culture and economy. And so many of the artists in the exhibition were actually digital natives. So they were born more or less to the current moment where we live. But so for this group of artists, the physical and virtual worlds are more or less inseparable components of the same merged reality. And Tuomas Laitinen is one of the artists that took part in the exhibition, and this is actually a commission work that he did for us, Receptor. And in this work, he was also using the AI as a source of the text material that he was using in his video work. So it was actually used with the help of computer programming that he had feed with different kinds of literature. And then the program was creating text on the basis of those chosen text. So it wasn't from the artist pen, so to say. Then another piece which was participatory, and this became probably one of the sort of like the most liked pieces in the exhibition, was by a group Laböf Rönke Turner. And in the center we have Nastja Säde-Rönke, a Finnish artist who has been collaborating on several occasions with Shia LaBeouf and Luke Turner on these collaborative projects. And alone together brought these 3 artists who were all housed for a month time in everybody was in different location in Lapland in a cottage, and their only connection was through this hut in the museum. And basically they were able to interact with each other only with the help of the audience at Kiasma. So the audience was sort of like passing messages from one artist to another in this cabin in the exhibition space. So it didn't have any virtual live the piece sort of like outside the museum, but everything was happening in this wooden cabin in the museum. And then one of the outcomes of that arts exhibition 2017 was that one part of the exhibition was virtual, it was online. And for that we commissioned also several new works by both Finnish and international artists. But then later on, we have developed this part, the online collection for the museum. So it is an art platform for digital art that people can use free of charge 24/7. So people can go and look at the digital works in our collection. And this collection actually grows with some 4 to 6 works every year. And it already houses over 50 works of different digital artworks. And it's currently on renovation. So in the beginning of next year, we will have again 5 new works on this site. And still, as an example, one of the works in that platform is Reija Meriläinen's Survivor, which is a game. So basically it can be played in an exhibition, like here, somebody is playing inside the exhibition in Kiasma, so from this game chair, but you can also play it on your own desktop at your home. So it's both usable in both ways. Then I think I have to rush a bit again. Sorry for that. Some examples of a kind of like more later paintings. So there were some examples like Heidi Lampenius and Hanna-Leena Heiska here, perhaps looking a bit more traditional. But then when taking painting into the space, I wanted to show you this example of Teemu Korpela's piece, which is the painting escaping its frames and pushing itself towards the gallery space and ending up on the floor, almost like a stream of lava. The painting installation engages in dialogue with the architecture of the space, and the canvases that he's been painting are actually all crushed and creased into bundles in the corner of the room and in the floor. Another kind of like more spatial approach to painting, or you would say here perhaps drawing, is Kim Somervuori's Ode to Posca, which has been painted with the help of Posca markers. So the artist has taken a lot of time to do all these markings into this small installation space, which actually is not that small because it even has a sofa that you can use and sit on. So kind of like engage in this total repetition after one after another. And it was almost a month's time. Every morning the artist came to the museum to do this installation. So very heavy work for him. And then some examples still. I mentioned the Helsinki School, which is a photography gallery and has been presenting schools, but has a very unique way where she's performing herself always in her photographs and playing around with the contents of her own house or home. So she seldomly goes outside there, but rather films and does all her video works as well as also her photographic works in the surrounding of her home, but then interacting with different kinds of objects. And again, I have to rush a bit. An example of the 2010s and the installations and sculptures, I wanted to show you this piece by Pia Männikkö. Pia Männikkö is an artist who is very interested in vision and how we see things. And in this piece, she was interested of the phenomena when traveling on a train. You see a landscape, but you see it blurred. And she wanted to create that as an artwork. And you have this massive machine that has actually a huge rug that is being propelled with the motors round and around, and this creates the visibility that you see from the window of the train, how the landscape gets blurred in front of your eyes. And then from the late 2010s, an example of art taking a stand on societal issues is Jani Leinonen's School of Disobedience, which is a real school. So inside the museum, we had a school building for disobedience or teaching disobedience for children or young people. And the artist invited people from different fields in Finnish, let's say, public life, musicians, artists, writers, to come as teachers and teach about different topics and how to be disobedient in the current society, and not always just going along the given guidelines and regulations. And then an example of a performative piece, a recent enter to the collection, is by an Iranian-born artist, but based in Finland already for over 10 years, Pita Rasavi. Her project was to get married. So it is a real legal performance. She got married, and that was creating her video work or performative work, which was then videoed. So it was also an actual event at the school when she was graduating from the art school, but then it ended up in the collection in the form of video documentation of the performance of the marriage, which then gave her the possibility to stay and work in Finland. And lastly, Nestori Syrjälä did for us a temporary public artwork in 2016 and 17. So for 1 year's time, we had a running man who was running from the museum for an hour once a week, dressed up as a busy businessman. So this was a public artwork, but in a temporary form. So it doesn't happen anymore. It was just for that 1 year. but it was a tryout with the State Art Commission to do a different kind of a public artwork for the cityscape, and it was quite well received both from the audience as well as from the media. And then few new buildings that have entered in the 2010s to the Finnish art scene and presenting Finnish contemporary art is in Mäntä, close to Tampere. The Serlachius Art Museum got a new building in 2014, the Gösta building, which was designed by Spanish architect duo. And here is a very recent image of their current exhibition with actually one of our collection works by Kimmos Roderus, that big black stretchy thing in the middle. And then Amos Rex, just across the street from our museum, a new space completely underground, as you can see in the smaller image, the lanterns that sort of like rise from the ground, and those are the sources of natural life to the space, where in the summer we saw an exhibition by Raija Malka, a Finnish painter, and Kaija Saariaho, a Finnish composer, who've been collaborating already or before together. And one of the new initiatives in the Helsinki and Finnish art scene is the Helsinki Biennial, which was taking place for the first time this summer in the Vallisaari Island. The Helsinki Biennial is organized by the Helsinki City Art Museum in this old fortress island. Quite an interesting event. Sadly, the traveling restrictions didn't necessarily allow so many foreign people to enjoy it, but I hope people are able to come to see it then in next time in 2 years when they do it again, probably also again in Vallisaari Island, which has a very specific nature. But then, to wrap up in the end, what's on artist's mind today? I would say that the questions of diversity, equality, and inclusion are becoming more and more important. And this is related to both identity questions, but then also to the fact that the Finnish contemporary art scene is getting more and more international and multicultural in a similar way, like the society is getting as well. Sustainability and ecology are currently one of the most sort of like hot topics among artists currently, and they've been also researched in many exhibitions in the past years. Then I could also pick up the human and non-human relationships that have been also very much present in artist work in the past years. And then what is an interesting feature is this participation and cross-pollination between different fields of arts, so that contemporary art, visual art is merging with music and performative live arts and so on. And this we will also do a lot at Kiasma, because we also have our own theater space. And especially in the spring, when we open the next Ars exhibition, Ars 22, that will also have a very rich live arts program. And then lastly, I picked here the indigenous knowledge. And with that, I mostly refer to the topic of Sami contemporary art, which is currently very much present in the Nordic art scene, and will be especially in next April when the next Venice Biennale opens, since the Nordic Pavilion in the Venice Biennale will be dedicated for the first time to Sami contemporary art. So the only indigenous peoples group living in the European Union will be presented for the first time with their own pavilion in the Venice Biennale, with artists from the Sami area, so from north of Norway, Finland, and Sweden. So I'll end here with this image of Marja Helander's work. She is one of the Sami artists in our collection, Birds in the Earth, a very beautiful video work. So sorry that I had to haste a bit and didn't manage to share all the things that I wished to share with you tonight. but I think it's now time for Jussi, and if there are some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kati, for this beautiful and visual journey through the last 30 years of Finnish contemporary art. I'd like to remind you that if you have any questions, please do share them at either of the chat windows in YouTube. So far, I don't see any questions, but maybe I have a couple in mind. I'd like to ask you about the kind of the audience base of contemporary art in Finland, because I remember I was a teenager when Kiasma was opened, and there was quite a big public discussion about the role of contemporary art in society and what defines as art. But I feel like that over the years we have moved rather ahead from that, and I have the feeling that there is already a rather solid audience base for contemporary art, and the art itself doesn't have to kind of argue so much about its validity, if you would like to put it that way. So just maybe if you have a couple of words from that, would be interesting to hear.
Thank you, Jussi. That's a good question. And when Kiasma opened in '98, it was still a bit more challenging to kind of like to find base for contemporary art, because everybody still remembered the 1995 Ars exhibition, which was sort of like it was very dividing. There were people who were completely interested and sort of like surprised about the contemporary art, but then there were some works that were really dividing the people, and some people perhaps even hated contemporary art. So it put a stigma for contemporary art for a long time. But then in Kiasma, for example, we've been working with, for example, young audiences from the very beginning a lot. So I could say that we now already have these people in their 20s and 30s who have learned and grown with the museum in a way. They've been taking part in workshops and so on. So for them, it has been always there, the contemporary art, and they've been able to use the space when they were still under 18, because it's free for all the kids and teenagers to come to the museum. So they've been really using it in their own ways. And I think for a long time, the challenge for us mostly has been how to reach the elderly people, because our audiences for a long time have been mostly around 70% of them have been 35 or under. So it has been a more challenge for us to get a bit elderly people to see contemporary art. They usually go to Atheneum to see more traditional art. But this has now changed in the past 5 years or so. The Finnish Museum Union became, or they initiated this museum card in Finland, which is a card that the museums can take and people buy it for 1 year, and you can visit as many museums as you want with that card. And that has changed our profile. And now we are really sort of like, we have to rethink about also our programming a bit, because we have now found also those educated female audiences, women in their 60s and 70s, who now suddenly have started to visit also Kiasma much more. So I think contemporary art has a very safe place when it comes to audiences in Finland, and we have many good institutions for contemporary art. But then I think the challenges are then perhaps more than on the support side, I would say, how to fund the contemporary art in Finland.
Okay, maybe one more question about the digital art. You mentioned that there is a relevant amount of, for example, video work in Kiasma's collections. And what I've noticed in Russia during the last year or so, there's been a lot of discussion about the NFT art. And is this something that is on the agenda, or would it be possible for you to acquire such digital art in your publicly funded collections?
That's a good question. During this year, it has popped in different places, both in Finland and also abroad. I've been faced with this question. And actually, it was just last week our director, Leevi Haapala, was talking about this topic at the Slush, which is this event for funders and startups in Helsinki. So they held a discussion on in NTFs there. But we've been talking a bit about them, but I'm still sort of like waiting to find a piece that would be content-wisely interesting enough. So I'm not necessarily interested just on the phenomena for the sake of that, but rather that it would also need to have interesting content, perhaps also an interesting artist who is working on that. But I just recently saw an interesting example in Denmark. The Museum of the Roskilde Museum of Contemporary Art actually bought the first for their collection, and it's quite nice piece because it's a piece that also the audience can then 3D print for themselves, so that it's a kind of like a piece that the museum shares with its audience if you wish. So you can also get access to the same and get a copy of the same, which is a kind of like a GIF animated sculpture by a Danish female artist.
Okay, maybe a final question. I see that so far we don't have any questions in the chat, so I might just conclude with one. You mentioned that the renovation of Kiasma will be completed next spring in April. And can you share if you have any plans for the opening exhibition, or is it still a secret?
No, we shared the knowledge already, was it last month? So we will open the renovated building with the next Ars exhibition, Ars 22. And this exhibition will actually for the first time also include some historical works from the past Ars exhibitions, because it will be the 10th Ars exhibition, though they've been organized since 1960s, but as they've been so irregular in the beginning, so there has been perhaps only one Ars exhibition in one decade. So this is only the 10th, but for the celebration, we are bringing together both contemporary art and live arts. So there is more live arts in the exhibition than before, but also that we have brought some pieces that are reminiscent of the previous Ars exhibitions, works that are either in our own collection, but then also we have loaned some from the Tampere, from the Sara Hildén Art Museum, which has quite a good collection of works from the early Ars exhibitions in the 60s and 70s in their amazing collection.
Okay.
So that is the whole house starting in the beginning of April, and then in the end of the year we have some other shows coming, like for example Markus Kopper, the Finnish sculptor. We will do his major solo exhibition at the end of the year, and that is celebrating the artist who unfortunately died a couple of years ago. So it's a bit of a homage to his career.
Okay, so sounds really exciting. So you're gonna have like a dialogue of different decades in a way, as in your presentation today.
Exactly.
And now we just hope that the borders will be fully opened and the guests from Russia will be able to see it as well.
Yes, because they have been always one of our biggest international audiences. So I truly hope that that will be possible soon again.
Okay, thank you, Kati, so much for your presentation and insight and discussion, and huge thanks to all of the participants. And just as a reminder, the video of this event will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after. Have a good night and thanks again.
Thank you.